Welcome to Regulate Tech with me, Nicklas, Berild, Lundblad, and
with me, Richard Allan.
This is our 16th episode, and we decided we would make it a craft episode, and we would dig into the exciting world of org charts. So we talked about the role and function of a policy team in our first craft session. But then if you continue down the path of building a policy team, what becomes important quite quickly is to figure out, where do you place people? How do you build it out? And, at what point do you start with a geographical model, or do you start with an issues model, or what is the, and how do you think about this when you're looking at sort of how you're building your team out?
Yeah, so there's a temptation to sort of throw people at where there's the most noise, like with everything there's this old saying that the squeaky wheel gets the most oil, as it were. So that's obviously the risk, and let's put that out there straight away. And we've been there. I think everybody's been there in an organization, not just in policy function, but in every function where something's going wrong, and so you kind of throw people at that problem, and then you find later that the problem's moved on, and you got the wrong people in the wrong places. So I think it's really important to stand back and sort of try and project forward as to what you're going to need where. And the framing I like is one of superpowers. So I think of what are the superpowers that we need collectively as a company to deal with the kind of stuff that's going to come at us. And some of those will be linguistic. We need German speakers or Swedish speakers. Some of them will be technical knowledge. We need people who understand fintech and financial regulation, or we need people who understand privacy regulation. And some of them will be sort of more generalist. We need people who are really good public speakers who can go out there and represent our position. And so, if we're going to build the org chart, thinking about what are the superpowers you need today, and what are the superpowers you're going to need in a year's time, 2 years' time, 3 years' time. And then just to complicate it all even more, how do we sort of plan for change so that if our projections are wrong, the people that we've got can kind of be molded into the structure that we find we actually need in 2 or 3 years' time.
I think it's really interesting, because what it brings home to me is I think most people start in a very different place with a geographical distribution. Where do I need people? What you're saying is, no, let's not do that. Let's talk instead about the capabilities that we need and have those capabilities inform the way we build out the team. The geographical location is fixable. It's something that you can sort over time, and you can you can send people to places, and that's actually quite useful and underutilized in many senses. But what happens in these policy teams is that there's noise in a place, to your point about the squeaky wheel, and so people then automatically think geographically we need somebody in that place. So I have never seen a policy team built out on a geographical agnostic principle. I've always most of the teams I've seen built have been built in sort of, well, here are the markets, and let's see if we can find someone there.
Yeah, well, sometimes it's actually a necessity, and I think this is particularly true for tech companies, where you don't necessarily need to open an office in every country that's of interest to you as a business. And so certainly I had scenarios where, we would discuss whether or not we'd open an office in a particular country. The decision was taken not to. There wasn't all the factors didn't stack up, and there's a lot of complicated factors when you're deciding whether to open an office. It's a very expensive business, getting it all right. And so we decided not to, but we still needed someone to deal with the policy issues there. And that's when I started to realize, yes, that, when I say I need, a policy person for a country like, I don't know, Italy, what I actually mean is I need someone who speaks Italian and understands the political situation, how politics works in Italy. And that person, typically, yes, I'm going to look at Rome or Milan because that's where a lot of these people will be based. But if I have got somebody in another place, another part of the world, who is able to speak Italian, understands Italian politics, well, they've got the superpowers I need, and they can do the job. And I say sometimes that's a deliberate choice, but quite often it's a sort of force majeure that you don't have the office there, therefore you're going to have the person based somewhere else. And I found some of those relationships actually were the most successful. Some of those people would be the most successful because they were sort of integrated into a broader team, and yet they had the superpowers that we needed to manage a particular geography, a particular country.
I think that's right, and I think that there are a couple of really stark cases. If we let's start with Europe, because that's where we have sort of the core of our experience. And I think one of the interesting things you run into quite quickly is this question about Brussels or the member states, and specifically because of what you just mentioned, almost no tech company opens a business office in Brussels as a priority. It's like a tier 2 market, tier 3 market, depending on what your business is, because Brussels is sort of not a business hub in that sense. But as a policy person, you're going to have to, really argue in your company that, well, we need a Brussels office because a lot of the politics and the policy is decided in Brussels. But do you start, if you're let's assume you have 5 people, do you put one person in Brussels, or do you start with the member states? Because Brussels and DC, for example, are very different. And that's a thing that I think both you and I have sometimes struggled to explain, that DC is the center of political power. Brussels is the resultant of political power. There's a real difference there. It's sort of the political power exercise in Germany and France ends up in Brussels. So it's important to be there. But is it important first to be in Germany and France? How would you approach that?
Yeah, that's a great question, because there's this difference. And again, it's a theme that we come back to a lot. And I think quite rightly, this difference between the US and the EU is especially marked in the political sphere, where I've always thought that, yes, all of the political influence or the political power resides in the member states. But the execution, all of the legislation, the most important legislation for tech company tends to come out of Brussels. And so you have this sort of real sort of distinction. Whereas if you go to the US, yes, there's a lot of state-based legislation that's interesting, and some state-based political leaders who are interesting. But actually, the most powerful political leaders in the United States will be in Congress and executive, and the most significant legislation and the most significant actions that are going to take place at federal level. So we do have this real gap. There's some exceptions, actually, interestingly, on competition. For example, I'd say that the EU level competition enforcement now has sort of leapfrogged member state competition enforcement. But for lots of other areas like, law enforcement or, all the stuff that sort of matters on a day-to-day basis, that's happening at member state level. And the agenda is driven there. So to your very specific question, there is no doubt that the agenda in Brussels is most strongly influenced by political decisions taken, I think, in Berlin and Paris and a number of other member states. But, it's no sort of secret that if France and Germany get together and they want something at EU level, that tends to be the most powerful political driver. So if you're trying to shape European legislation, excuse me, I need to cough for a second.
Let's cough, it's fine.
If you're trying to shape European legislation, then the roots of the European legislation are going to be in Paris and Berlin, but the detailed proposals are going to be in Brussels. So you have to cover both, essentially. It depends what stage you're trying to intervene at. If you're trying to intervene at the stage at which policy is being formulated, political will is being developed to, for example, legislate for something, some counter-terrorism measure. There's an example at the moment. We want platforms to remove terrorist material. So if you want to, be involved in the political debate as to whether or not the EU should create such a legal instrument, Paris, Brussels, and a number of other member states are going to be the most important. Paris and Berlin, rather, and a number of other member states will be the most important. If you then want to get involved in the detail of what that regulation looks like, you've got to be in Brussels. So both. is the answer to your question.
Why not both? Like the kid says in the meme, right?
Yeah.
I mean, the thing I really like about that is that I also think you're teasing out something else, which is that it's a little bit about the time machine, right? You can get at the issue early in Berlin and Paris, but when it actually reaches Brussels, it's not fully baked, but it's half baked, and so that means that I'm not saying half baked ideas in Brussels. I'm sort of saying that, but I'm not saying that.
No.
Not being cheeky about this, but it's more resolved, because when it comes to Brussels, a lot of discussions will already have happened. So it's a little bit like when you're working in a national market. If you're sort of addressing a bill that's been proposed by government in Parliament, you're too late. Yeah. You should be there before it becomes a bill, right? So we're back to our 5 people. We have the capabilities perspective, but we also need to sort of figure out the geographics. Just out of curiosity, if we just go to the geographical distribution or the languages or the politicals, let's say the political landscapes they need to understand, how would you recruit the first 5?
Yeah, so I think that, again, that this is where it does in part depend on the kind of crises you're facing. So you've got this sort of long-term, short-term horizon that affects all companies. And long-term, there's no doubt that it's the big legislation. So the revisions of things like the privacy rules and the electronic commerce rules and all these things that are really going to be really material for your business. Whether or not it succeeds or fails could depend on those big pieces of legislation, but they're all 3, 4, 5-year projects. And then you've probably got something happening right now. So depending on the kind of business you've got, but it may be, I don't know, counterfeit goods being sold on your e-commerce platform, or threats to children on a social media platform. And those can come up anywhere. And so I think when you're picking your first 5 people, it's a mix of both. I would say you might want 2 or 3 people of those people focused on these long-term risks, because you don't want to take your eye off the ball. You don't want something to catch you 2 years later and go, well, why weren't we engaged on that? We could have, when we could have changed it, because if you're coming at the last minute, nothing's going to happen. And then I think you probably want a couple of those people in the markets with superpowers to deal with the very specific issues that are causing damage and pain to your business's reputation. So if you're an e-commerce business and your problem is that that there's a lot of fraud taking place in France, or France famously for counterfeit goods, because it's home to a lot of luxury goods manufacturers that have very powerful political voice. So if your issue was luxury fake counterfeit luxury goods being sold in France, and that was your issue, then that would sort of point you towards also having a firefighter type person able to get on top of that before it gets completely out of control. And so I say, again, different strokes for different companies. Another company, it might be an issue of child safety in Italy, which again, people follow these things. The Italian prosecutors are very, very willing to take really robust action against companies where they think that they fail to get across something, and Google and Facebook have seen this at different times. So again, that might steer you towards saying, let's have someone who can try and stop things really sort of shooting out of control in Italy around particular issues that you have with your platform. So that's a sort of way of thinking about it. As I say, I would say 3 people probably of your 5 really focused on those long-term strategic issues for the company, and a couple of people designed or with the right kind of superpowers to deal with whatever is burning for your company in whichever country things are on fire. That would be the way I'd sort of structure those initial hires.
And I think, it goes to a favorite issue of mine, and that is, I think most companies create their central teams too late.
Yes.
And central teams are built on exactly the principle you're describing, the capability principle, right? What is it that we actually need to be able to do well and routinely, right? That's why you eventually end up with the central team. But the central team happens fairly late in a company's development of a policy capability. And I think that's, if you can sort of fix one thing, it's to get your central team or think about your capabilities before you think about your geographies. And I think that's really hard. But if there's something that I think we can tease out from what you're saying and from what I very much agree with, are sort of collective learnings, it's think about that central team that you can use and distribute as your first point of sort of reference, and then think about your geographies, because those are important. I mean, it's really hard to work across time zones, etc., etc. So if you put all of your people over in California and you say, I have all of the superpowers, they speak German, they will still not quite cut it, right? They will still not be effective. You need to have people close to where they're going to work and influence. There's a day-to-day that matters, but you should really not start there. You should start with the capabilities and the central team. So how do you think about central teams? This is we're into the nitty-gritty now, but this is fun. Yeah,
exactly. And I like my analogies, and here the best analogy I came up with as I was working on this was that of a hospital. And a hospital, but the different kind of doctors that you need, and actually need both. So you need the kind of generalists who love working in the accident and emergency department and triage patients on the way in. But then they will send them off. They've decided what it is. It's a kidney problem or a heart problem, whatever. And then they go to the specialist who deals with that problem. And if you get this wrong, if you have, heart specialists in A&E who can only really diagnose heart problems, that's not going to work. And equally, if you have A&E doctors trying to do very sort of complex specialist procedures, that's not going to work. So I think a really well-balanced policy team, if you recognize the ailments that are going to come to you, they're going to come through the front door through an A&E department. So that's the equivalent of your people out there in different countries, out in the field, sort of dealing with governments, and you've got to get people who just love getting problems and triaging them. But if you expect those people in the field to deal with really, really complex technical issues, so that something comes through, they diagnose it, it's a thing about detailed banking and e-money regulation, and you ask your A&E equivalent doctor sort of deal with that, they're probably not going to do a great job, not because they're bad people, but because it's just too specialist. So where are they going to send it to? And that's your central team. So your central team, I think, primarily, I mean, there's other functions you can add in, but the core of that is that it's like your specialist surgeons. It's people who really focus on particular difficult, complex issues. And so balancing that up, again, we'd sometimes have the debate, do you favor the people out there in the field, or do you favor people back in the center? Answer, you need both. A hospital that only has A&E doctors and no specialists ain't going to fix you. A hospital that only has specialists and no A&E doctors triaging people on the way in and making sure they get to the right person ain't going to give you the results. So it's that balance, I think, that we're looking for.
And you want to build it early. You don't want to sort of have an entirely geographically organized team and then discover that you don't have that beating heart of the organization that a central team is. I think that's the thing that and there are a couple of things with central teams that I think are often overlooked and are really, really simple. A central team is like the clock of an organization. It sort of sets the rhythm, it sets the pace, and that's so important, because often, for example, planning or reporting, etc., will end up in the central team. And having that beating pulse be something that affects the entire organization and syncs it, frankly, I think is also something that gives you much more than the sum of the parts. Because if you get there, the central team will actually augment the geographical teams in a great way by taking what happens in India and the learnings there over to, for example, Latin America, being able to translate it and use some of the same materials and research, etc. So this notion of the central team as a kind of pace setting, a kind of internal clock and the sort of cycles all the time, I think is also really important, because most organizations, they have lots of different problems. But one of the problems that I see most often in organizations is that they lack rhythm. They lack this clock. And I think that that's something a central team gives if it's managed well and if it's given the opportunity to do so. And then the expertise, all of the specialists, I really like I think the hospital analogy is brilliant. It's really good. And I think that's something that can and should probably be done much earlier. Now let's shift gears slightly. So you're building out the policy team, and you have a set budget to do that. It's hard to sort of just say, well, I want 150 headcount, and I'm just going to build this super duper policy team. And often you're faced with a really hard choice of, do I hire or do I get a consultant?
Yes.
Do I build or do I buy? build or buy? Where do I go with this? How do you think about the use of consultants vis-a-vis the increase of headcount?
Yeah, so I mean, as a general rule, I would say if somebody is speaking on behalf of the company, then they really need to be an employee of the company. Where consultants can do a lot of work, and I have huge respect and have had very good consultants over the years. But I think they're sort of largely focused on sort of support functions, if we can put it that way, that they're not going to be the face of your company. I don't think. I think it's kind of odd to have consultants out as the face of your company. But there's a lot of useful support functions they can do. The sort of first and baseline one is obviously intelligence gathering, that they can be tracking what's happening in a market. And I think that, again, can be very useful. So you might have a country where you're not ready for whatever reason. You're either not resourced or you've not reached the point where you think you need to put someone in there, and a consultant can help you track what's going on and help you to understand the landscape. So you're borrowing their superpowers about understanding the political world, accepting that if something does blow up, you're going to have to go in and deal with it. You can't just sort of let the consultant sort of send them in front of a parliament to testify on your behalf. You're going to be off doing that. So I think that can be very useful. One sort of warning, though, around that, which is I've also seen situations where people hire lots of consultants to track lots of stuff, and the reports pile up in people's inboxes, and eventually they set a filter up saying send to, reports to read later folder, and they never get read. So again, just as a warning,
yes, read later is where emails go to die, right?
Yes, yeah. So it should be real. So I'm going to hire a consultant because I want to track what's happening in a particular country. But I am going to read those reports, and I'm expecting to act on some of them some of the time. If not, let's not bother. The other areas where consultants can be sort of super helpful, again, is around organizing sort of series of events and campaigns. So again, when you're looking, you might have an issue, you want to go to a particular country and run a 6-month program around child safety. And again, a consultant who sort of understands and can do all that legwork and help you figure out what the right events to hold are, who to hold them with, where to hold them, all that sort of stuff. I think, again, really, really, really helpful. But that presupposes you've got somebody on the permanent staff driving it. So again, the ratio of consultant to permanent staff is something to sort of keep in mind. They are useful if they're executing and extending the reach of somebody who's permanently included. But I was doing some work the other day with someone, and I just sort of look at this, and they were talking about hiring consultants in markets. And I said, really, you need to budget, perhaps half a day a week to, if you're going to have a consultant in a particular country, then have you got half a day a week to make sure that you're reading their reports, you're engaging with them, you're running that relationship properly. So that's half a day out of the 10 half days that you have in a working week. So you might be able to get 10x effectiveness. If in your half day, managing the consultant, you effectively get a full week's work done for you in that country, great. But if you're spending half a day on it and you're only really getting a day's worth of value out of it, you've got to ask whether that's a fair trade-off.
Yeah. And I think, if we take the other side for a while, I think the greatest frustrations for consultants has to be the really bad buyers who sort of just say, I want this. And then they sort of explode when they haven't been given what they haven't been asking for. And I think there are a lot of really bad buyers for consultants out there that haven't thought through exactly what you said, the ratio. What's my absorption capacity for consultants? Consultants, though they do require resources to generate value. It's like any other thing. I think that for me, the build buy equation is also another way to look at it is that if you hire people, every single thing they do compound over time and generates value for the policy team overall. Whereas if you buy, you compound in the consultancy, which can be good because it increases their capacity to do, say, intelligence gathering. But one of the peculiarities of a policy team is that if you hire someone today, you will have to count with them building up over time and becoming more and more effective. And it's perhaps after a year or 2 years that they're going to be at their absolute sort of, that's when they're going to be fully operative. We talk about engineers and say, it takes 6 months for an engineer to learn Facebook systems or Google systems. So the first 6 months are sort of essentially we're training them. But for policy people, it's even a little bit longer than that. But it's not, you don't the full operational capacity of somebody you hire and also their role in the team can take up to 2 years, which means that you should always hire for where you think you'll be in 2 years' time and not hire to crisis. I think hire to crisis is natural. It's sort of a very natural reaction, but it generates more crisis, and it sort of ensures that you're in this state of perpetually fixing things and never have the capability to do the long-term influence work, I think.
That's exactly right. And those new people you've hired are going to take resources of the existing people if they're going to be developed correctly. And again, I think that's another sort of common
You should
mistake.
talk about your theory about, management and how much time goes into management, because I found that when you told me that the first time, I found it very insightful and almost wholly ignored.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really interesting.
Again, just thinking through how long it's going to take to manage people. So again, I would estimate that on average, half a day per person. A week, half a day a week you're going to take up, and that's a combination of, you can do a one-to-one with them. I think there's some sort of normal structure at least in tech world. That's an hour, but you've got the follow-up actions of the one-to-one. You've got periodic reviews. You've got the emails that come in. So at least half a day. So if we think about that, we think about the fact that you have 4 direct reports. If somebody has 4 people reporting into them, that's 2 days of their week gone. If they're now managing a couple of sort of countries through consultants, that's another day a week gone. And so it's just really being conscious and saying, at what point, if you have 10 direct reports, you are a pure manager, I'd say. If you have 10 people directly reporting to you, they're not in a tree, but you're managing them directly, you have no time other than time to manage those people.
Yet still, I mean, the tech industry lionizes this notion of the player coach, right? You should be out there, you should do. But what you're saying essentially is, if you have, even if you just have 8 people reporting into you, that leaves you a day.
It leaves you a day, which you then may be using sort of for managing up, because again, this is all the managing down. You need some more time for all those meetings you get called into where you're managing up. It all takes time. So I think just having a framework like that and saying, okay. And for some people, it will be, you want them to be a pure manager. But if that's what they are, if they've got 8, 10 direct reports, except they're a pure manager, don't ask them ever, to go and testify at a committee hearing or do anything like that. That's going to take out 3 or 4 days of their time, because that's going to leave their people unmanaged, and that's going to reduce the effectiveness of the organization overall. So I say, just be really conscious and say, this is how much management I want to do. And this is how much time I want to work on issues, directly on issues, and then balance my working week and structure my team accordingly. And so again, another trick might be if I'm looking at it and, I've got 4 direct reports, great, that's 2 days, but I'm spending another day managing these consultants, to cover another couple of countries. Maybe you move the management of those consultants to one of your direct reports. You've got a day back. So just being really, really conscious about how your time is being spent. And
realistic, I think.
And realistic, yeah.
Really realistic about this half-day measure that I think is so good. Now, so let's back up a little bit. We're designing our policy team, and let's now, for the sake of argument, go geographical. We'll talk geographical. We'll start in the European Union. So a very common model is to have a few people in Brussels that sort of manage often organized to manage Parliament, Council, Commission. So they have different expertise. They mirror their outside environment. Then you have people in Berlin and Paris. If you have more people than that, you start looking at Southern Europe. How do you think about Spain, Italy, and how do you sort of cluster those? I'd love to hear your views on that. Then you look at the northern part of Europe and you're like, okay, there's sort of a lot of commonalities here. They seem not to hate technology, which is great. How can we get them together? Yeah. And then you have the Central Eastern European market, which I think is often horribly underestimated, where there's so much really interesting things there, and not a lot of other companies are there. So rushing sort of to where everyone else is not necessarily the best way of organizing your team. How do you think about Europe as a game, or as a puzzle, or as a landscape for distributing resources?
It is a game of 3-dimensional chess, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Everything plays out on multiple levels, particularly between the different institutions. So again, something I learned quite late. So I don't think I did this at the beginning, but if I was rebuilding now, I would definitely look at is look at the political structures that the countries themselves are creating. and think in those terms. So even within the EU, you've got groups like there's the Visegrad group, which is
Visegrad 4, yeah.
Greece, like forum of a group of Central Eastern European countries sort of organised together. There's the D9 group, which is the tech-friendly Northerners and things, and these sort of different fora. And it's really interesting to say, in a sense, if you're building a team to look at how the politicians group themselves and see themselves, and then align with those sort of natural groupings that exist. So I think if I was studying now, I would be much more inclined to be thinking, who is it who's going to be managing these different subgroupings, and what superpowers do I need?
Manager, a Visegrad 4 manager. I like that.
Yeah,
that's you're right. That's something that is not done often, but you sort of go immediately to the national framework, right?
Yeah, and you just, for sort of very practical reasons, if you haven't got people in every single country, you're trying to sort of concentrate things, that works. But also because these groupings have a real political agenda that they then bring to Brussels. So again, to be there where they're forming their joint political positions and be involved in that actually just is a better, perhaps more effective place to be sometimes than even in the individual national parliaments, because this is a place to say where very explicitly they'll often be crafting an agenda that's going to go that they're going to input collectively as a group into the Brussels agenda. So being there, I think, is critical. So that's one way of sort of looking at it, and I think that's something I learned over time. Happy to share that if I was redoing this thing now, I would start by sort of mapping out all of these different political groupings. Where's the action? Where do member states see their own alliances, and how are they organising themselves? And then beyond that, I'd certainly agree with you. I think Central and Eastern Europe is neglected, and I think actually I regret this. I think it's at the moment it's sort of quite a sort of negative, these are the troublemakers connotation, I think, particularly around obviously the current political leadership in Poland and Hungary. And I think that's actually regrettable for all sorts of reasons. I mean, you have views on the politics of it, but from an EU policy forming point of view, I worry that what was sort of quite positive, that the EU policy making conversation had expanded with all of the Central and Eastern European countries coming in and joining in, and this sort of Franco-German sort of alliance thing had, in a sense, been broadened out, I think, to include a broader range of voices, some of whom, from a tech perspective, are extremely friendly. And we think of countries like Estonia, very famously, super tech friendly. And I sort of worry a little bit. Sort of at the moment, there's been a bit of a retreat back to it's the West versus the East, the liberal West versus the conservative East.
And it's exacerbated by the fact that I think that many of these Central Eastern European countries are now seeing massive investments from, for example, China, which creates sort of a bit of a rift and a tension. And I think my sense is also that many of these countries are better set up to take advantage of technological competitiveness because they don't have the legacy systems, and they don't have a lot of stuff installed already that they need to uninstall before they can take advantage of new technologies. But I like the idea of using these political groupings as an organizational principle. Now, it's glaringly obvious and kind of interesting. Now, we've been talking about Europe and we haven't even mentioned the UK. Oh, yes. So how do we think about the UK post-Brexit? How would you're responsible for a policy team. Do you treat the UK as its own market? Do you treat it still as a European country? How would you think about it now?
I mean, it's still to be decided, but there are really two paths, and this is what I'll be looking at and trying to predict which of these is likely to be true. There is one path in which essentially the UK stays pretty aligned with EU regulation. Yes, we have the right to strike out in our own direction, but for all sorts of commercial reasons, we choose not to.
The Norwegian path.
The Norwegian path, without the formality of being in EFTA, Norway is bound in. So it's maybe a little bit more Swiss, the Swiss path. The Swiss are much more, they reserve the right to be different, but every time they head off in a different direction, the EU threatens them, they kind of, row back into line. So there's something that's a bit more of a big Switzerland sort of path, where, again, from a tech policy point of view, there are very strong reasons why the UK would maintain pretty much full compatibility with the data protection regulation. large amounts of capacity with whatever's happening around electronic commerce, electronic money, all of these sort of critical areas. And that the UK's got this thing called the Online Harms Bill, that would be aligned with the Digital Services Act. You can see that sort of a logic for that. That's model one. And in that case, you do want to, you're still treating the UK as sort of within the EU ambit, certainly when compared with India or Colombia or anywhere else, or US or anywhere else in the world, and you can sort of manage it together. But there is a second path, and the rhetoric of Brexit suggested they would go this way, which is where the UK does try to strike out on its own. This is they sort of nickname it the Singapore-on-Thames model, where the UK very deliberately goes, no, we're going to rip up all that data protection stuff. We don't really care about cross-border data flows. We're going to, we believe that our British businesses should be able to do lots more creative and interesting stuff with data than those terrible restrictive EU rules allow. We're going to be a sort of massive regulatory sandbox where anything goes. So that model is a possibility, and it was certainly there in the rhetoric. Question, when push comes to shove and businesses are told, well, rather government is told, if you go in that direction, your businesses will no longer be able to do all sorts of things that they can do today in terms of trading with the EU. Will they go that way? And so I think that's the sort of really critical question that anyone in this business needs to be looking at now and reading the tea leaves. It's really hard. There's no one who can definitively say to you that in 5 years' time, Britain will definitely be super Switzerland or Singapore on Thames or any point in between. All we can do is sort of make a guess. And at the moment, my guess is more super Switzerland, just because I think the economic logic is so compelling. But having said that, a lot of us felt the economic logic was compelling for Britain to remain in the EU, and economic logic be damned, the decision was taken. So we could be wrong. But it just feels that that's the balance is on that side of the argument at the moment.
If you then take a step back and think about a global policy team, at least in the second model that you're referencing, you would break the UK out and have the UK lead report directly into you as a global lead, because the UK is its own market, its own sort of entity, and because of its enormous commercial value to most tech companies, at least, it deserves sort of its own representation. So you would have the UK, you would have the European Union, and then you would have, different kinds of other segmentations, right? It would, in a sense, it would elevate the UK from being a part of a region to being its own separate market.
That would be very gratifying for the government. I think that's what they're waiting for. That's what Brexit was all about, being able to have the UK representatives not wrapped up in it. No, on a serious point, that the weighting of different markets, I think, is really interesting. It sort of brings out this broader point. So again, we talked about the capacity. So the global team lead has to think about how they're going to spend their half days of management time. And again, I would argue that they're going to really struggle if they've got more than 4 or 5 people reporting into them. So they've got to figure out who are those 4 or 5 people that they need to have reporting into them. Having said that, they generally end up with more for political reasons, like internal reasons of internal politics. But let's assume in the ideal world, they've managed to hold the line and they've got, say, 5 people reporting into them. Who those 5 should be is critical, because not because it doesn't mean they don't know what's going on in countries below those people, but because every layer tends to soften the urgency of a message and slightly reduces priority. And I had this experience on many occasions where something's really burning in a particular country, but you relay the message. I would be hearing, from the person in that country, oh my God, yeah, everything's on fire. We're really hurting here. And so I get that message. I go to my boss and I go, ooh, there's quite a bit of trouble going on in this country. I think we really pay attention. And then my boss goes to their boss and they go, yeah, I did hear something about that country. There's something happening. And it's sort of each layer has become slightly less urgent from the first person who's sort of red in the face and shouting at you. And so these reporting does matter. So yeah, deciding who you want to hear from, the raw, direct, unfiltered stuff matters. And the weighting can be on a number of different factors. Some of it is commercial importance. some of it is political importance, and again, we've talked in our jurisdiction a question
Yeah,
about
yeah.
this. That look, the US is the only inescapable jurisdiction for a US tech company. China is the only inescapable jurisdiction for Chinese tech companies. So, of course, your home jurisdiction has the first seat at the table.
Right.
And then you start allocating them after that, I think, according to a number of different factors, some commercial, some actually regulatory. So if somebody is a regulatory pioneer and setting the agenda and the tone for other countries, they may move higher up the agenda. So arguably, actually, some of the EU regulation is as important for a tech company in that it's being copied in other regions of the world as it is because it affects the EU market. There are countries that really want to strike in their own direction. There are others. Russia would be an interesting example where, it's definitely got its own very strong, robust regulatory agenda that's different from the rest of the world, but arguably is not one that's going to be copied. It's not that people are queuing up to adopt Russian regulation. So if you look at sort of Russia and the EU is much more significant in that it's creating regulation that will, the privacy regulation has been adopted by most Latin American countries, for example.
And they're actively also proposing their legislation. They have even budgets for sort of evangelizing the regulatory work they do in order to make sure that spreads. So they then become a much more important player, I think. But So both you and I headed up this nebulous region called EMEA, Europe, Middle East, Africa, Russia. I think a long-term observation would be, I think that's going to break up, that people are going to have the European Union be one, and then perhaps put a little more emphasis on Africa because it's such a growth region. So if you look at your 5 that the global lead has, I think it used to be that they had the US, they had APAC, which is sort of a really diverse region, and one that I think is also a bit understood, if you want, where you can do much more. You would have EMEA, then you would have some kind of central team, and those would be the sort of 4 core that you always had in the global team. I mean, if I was to predict how this evolves over time, I think the US obviously remain. I think EMEA breaks out into the European Union being sort of its own. I think the UK breaks out into being its own, and then I think that APAC and MEA, the Middle East, Africa, Russia, Turkey, and all of the APAC, is sort of still to be decided. But I would not be surprised if companies, especially tech companies, start to think about Africa as a region of such importance that it cannot be layered. What do you think?
Yeah. So again, this is in the weighting. It's really interesting that you're waiting for. Weighting, that's WEIGHTING,
Yes.
wait, not waiting for Godot. But the weighting in your weightings, Africa is a huge region by population. And as we always remember, Africa is a continent, not a country, but it's a huge continent by population. It's clearly a sort of very strong future growth market. In many cases, it's done the technology leapfrogging so that, it was mobile first. All sorts of really interesting reasons to look at Africa or look at different countries within Africa. But yes, once you do break it down, you actually have different blocks. And this maybe, again, is building on what I said about the European Union, a different way of thinking about your policy team, maybe to look at where the way in which governments are grouping themselves together. And so rather than be thinking of APAC, the region, and these names tend to be based on sales organizations. So the way you cluster sales stuff. So much more interesting is ASEAN, which is the political organization. Actually, in Latin America, you've got things like the Andean Pact and Mercosur. You've got different groupings. In Africa, there's obviously the African Union, but then there's a group of other different South African development community things. There's a whole bunch of different sort of ways in which governments organize themselves. And I say, and they can be very, very different within a continent. So again, just as we talked about, there's a risk that we're in Europe, we're kind of going, yes, there are these different sort of communities and different cultures that exist in southern, western, eastern, northern Europe, etc. And then you come to Africa and you go, but Africa is just a monolith.
Yes.
Actually, no, there are different cultures, clustered around Nigeria, around Kenya, around South Africa, and different dynamics taking place, francophone dynamics and anglophone dynamics, etc. And so I think, just looking at the political dynamics on the ground, like and this is very public, who's organising conferences, what's on the agenda, where do the IT ministers of francophone countries in Africa get together, and then thinking about how you scale your team against that rather than say against a sales organisation or anything else. The only downside, though, again, always flip it around, is that internally to your company, you may find that you have powerful leaders who are organized in these more classic groupings of LATAM, APAC, EMEA, and they want somebody who is coterminous with them. And the structure I'm describing actually may not be coterminous with any sort of other bit of your internal company structure, but I think it may be the right one for politics. You want your coterminosity to be with the way in which governments organize themselves, not the way in which your sales team of your company organize itself.
But that is such an interesting question, because we had both models, and I actually must say that I found the model where we were coterminous with the rest of the company really powerful, because it allowed us to play the full register, from sort of who the salespeople talk to and what they say, to the marketing campaigns dovetailing with the policy stuff. So it's not simple. I agree with you. I think the ideal political matching is very different from the corporate or business matching. But there is such power in being able to act as one team, as sort of one strong, even as a strong country. If you're in a country and you have a sort of a leadership group that does policy, PR, marketing, sales, and they all sort of take off their hats outside of the room and they go in and they solve for the country. There's a lot of value in that, I think. But I think you have to keep both things in your mind at the same time. Yeah. That you're a company, and so you need the cohesion of the national market. But if you are going to have a chance to influence politics, you need to understand these larger groupings like the SSA it's been Africa is really interesting, because everyone's been rushing to Nigeria, and sort of it's been if you could always, if you wanted to be simplistic about it, you can say it seems as if US tech has decided Nigeria is roughly Africa, and that's sort of where they're all going. And that, I think, is a point to your sort of analysis that underestimates the connectedness of African politics in an interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, just the sheer size or scale of the market in Nigeria and the immense amount of sort of creativity sort of makes it attractive. But in the same way, you look at a regional bloc like Europe, and Germany might, in a sense, occupy a similar position in the sense that that's where you put your first policy people, because it's again in a lot of ways the driver of the EU. Doesn't mean you ignore the rest of the EU, but you're sort of focused on one first. So I think there's been that sort of drive to get into that market. And again, partly I think for the business alignment you just talked about, it's often Nigeria will often be the first place. Nigeria or South Africa actually tend to be the sort of first places that a company will open its business offices, and so there is that. I think your point about yes, the power of working with your colleagues is right, and so maybe the answer is sort of surface. Maybe this is a general theme that don't keep this stuff mysterious. Have surfaced the fact that there are differences in terms of your political alignment and your business alignment, and talk about how you're going to mesh those two together, rather than ending up with a political battle. It's sort of internal political battle of, the business aligners versus the politics aligners.
Oh no, that would, I agree.
The same with the central, field teams. Again, the worst thing is when you end up in a battle, it's sort of either or. Yeah. It's actually both and. So again, surface that, talk about the fact that there is a real tension between, can we get our first person into Nigeria because that's now an important market, versus do we put a fintech specialist in the center because we've got some issues around financial products we're developing? Those are real tensions. Just surface them, but don't make it we, the field team, against the back end team, or we, the back end team.
Make the decisions smaller. Don't make them about the tensions. I think making decisions smaller is always important. Now, we're almost at time. I wanted to, before we sort of close out this episode, and there will be more of these craft episodes going forward, what's the one thing that you think is a huge mistake to make when you're organizing a policy team?
I think it is to hire for connections. So just to be clear, that there is this sort of view that, well,
Absolutely.
if I hire somebody who knows people, that's fine. Again, it's not to say sometimes you can hire a politician and they can be brilliant and they do know people, but you're not hiring them because they know people. You're hiring them because they're a trusted voice on the issues that you care about, because they've been involved in those issues for years. So to hire a politician
really well, right?
Yeah. So you hire a politician who's been involved in tech stuff because people know them as a good person on tech. You don't hire someone who's just got great connections, but knows nothing about tech, and then you bring them in and you kind of go, oh, just give me the connection.
That's the ancient model of lobbying, right? You just hire someone who has all of the connections and has smoked cigars with all of the important people. Never ever works.
No, and I think it's not a superpower.
Right.
That is not. It's not a super. Being connected is not a superpower.
Right.
The superpower is, say, being somebody who has a track record of being really good on tech policy issues. And now they have connections because of that superpower. But being connected in and of itself is not, I don't think, a superpower you should be hiring for. There we go. I think we're aligned.
To end this 16th episode of Regulate Tech, and you can find the podcast at your website, which is
www.regulate.tech.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And keep your ideas coming and questions and thoughts. And if you have any proposals for what we should discuss next, both in craft and otherwise, don't hesitate to contact or reach out. Thank you so much for listening, and hope to have you listen again next week.